Is anarchism an ideology best suited to advocates of freedom? Introduction. To answer the question of whether anarchism is an ideology best suited to advocates of freedom, we must first be clear about two things. What kind of freedom and what kind of anarchism? It will be argued here that if by freedom we mean the materialist conception of freedom, expounded by authors including but not limited to Karl Marx, Mikhail Bakunin and Enrico Malatesta, then anarchism, understood in terms of the social anarchist school of thought and action, may deliver freedom in spades, both in theory and in practice, provided that the reader is willing to commit. The materialist conception of freedom. Freedom plays a central role in anarchist thought. The materialist conception of freedom can be summarized thus. To be free is to have access to the real possibility of engaging in self-directed activity through which one develops human capacities to the fullest extent. This definition is an anarchistic synthesis of the views of various authors. Karl Marx, for instance, consistently held a view of free activity as integral to one's humanity, all the way through from the early ideas about species being present in the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, 1844, to the later ideas in the 3 volumes of Capital, 1867 to 1894. In the manuscripts, Marx writes, "Conscious life activity directly distinguishes man from animal life activity. Only because of that is he a species being. Or rather, he is a conscious being, i.e. his own life is an object for him only because he is a species being. Only because of that is his activity free activity." This line of thinking is expressed in a similar form in the first volume of Capital. Marx writes, "We presuppose labour in a form in which it is an exclusively human characteristic. A spider conducts operations which resemble those of the weaver, and a bee would put many a human architect to shame by the construction of its honeycomb cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is that the architect builds the cell in his mind before he constructs it in wax." Man not only effects a change of form in the materials of nature, he also realizes his own purposes in those materials. Later, in Capital Volume 3, Marx refers to the development of human powers as an end in itself as being the true realm of freedom. Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin presents a similar view in Man, Society and Freedom, written in 1871. Bakunin writes that the materialistic conception of freedom is therefore a very positive, very complex thing, and above all, eminently social, because it can be realized only in society and by the strictest equality and solidarity among all men. Bakunin also says that, quote, "I am truly free only when all human beings, men and women, are equally free. The freedom of other men, far from negating or limiting my freedom, is, on the contrary, its necessary premise and confirmation." End quote. And that freedom consists in, quote, "the fullest development of all the faculties and powers of every human being, by education, by scientific training, and by material prosperity, things which can only be provided for every individual by the collective, material, intellectual, manual, and sedentary labour of society in general." Notice the close similarity to Marx's view regarding the idea of human development. Italian anarchist Enrico Malatesta agrees with Bakunin's idea of solidarity, arguing in the popular pamphlet Anarchy in around 1892 that the principle of solidarity causes the liberty of each to find not its limits but its complement, the necessary condition of its continual existence in the liberty of all. Anarchists therefore see freedom as fundamentally connected to the ideas of solidarity and equality. One cannot have freedom without solidarity and equality. If I wish to learn the piano, for example, I must be a part of a society which makes pianos and which provides training for pianists. This requires cooperation, which is what anarchists mean by solidarity. But at the same time, if everybody were to be allocated a piano and a teacher by some centralised institution, regardless of whether they wanted to learn the piano, such a society would simply be boring to live in, and said society would waste resources. The equality sought after by anarchists is the equality of free horizontal diversity, rather than coerced hierarchical uniformity. Only the collective action of the whole society can secure freedom for every human being. Bakunin writes, "Man becomes conscious of himself and his humanity only in society and only by the collective action of the whole society. He frees himself from the yoke of external nature only by collective and social labour, which alone can transform the earth into an abode favourable to the development of humanity. Without such material emancipation, the intellectual and moral emancipation of the individual is impossible. Bakunin therefore concludes that, quote, the isolated individual cannot possibly become conscious of his freedom. The materialist conception of freedom therefore sees freedom as being an eminently social phenomenon. It is only as part of society that we have the possibility of doing, being, and becoming many different things. Given all of this, Margaret Thatcher's statement that there is no such thing as society may fairly be viewed as a barefaced assault on what it means to be free. Freedom under capitalism. Capitalism is the mode of production which emerged after feudalism, in which the means of production are owned privately, goods and services are exchanged for profit in a market economy, and there is remuneration for labour in the form of a wages system. Let us examine what freedoms are allowed by such a system. First and foremost, if the means of production are to be owned privately by individuals, then it will follow that a capitalist society is divided into those who own the means of production and those who do not. The means of production is the machinery needed to produce the things society needs to live. For example, factories, farms and offices. Thus, the owner of means of production, the capitalist, is in a considerable position of economic power over the worker, given that the worker, dispossessed of the means of production, has no choice but to engage in wage labour, scrape by on benefits, or starve. Marx therefore writes that capitalist production reproduces and perpetuates the conditions under which the worker is exploited. It incessantly forces him to sell his labour power in order to live, and enables the capitalist to purchase labour power in order that he may enrich himself. In reality, the worker belongs to capital before he has sold himself to the capitalist. His economic bondage is at once mediated through and concealed by the periodic renewal of the act by which he sells himself, his change of masters, and the oscillations in the market price of his labour. Marx later decries the accumulation of misery, the torment of labour, slavery, ignorance, brutalisation and moral degradation which the working class is saddled with under the conditions given by capitalism. Crucial to Marx's analysis is the fact that the worker lacks control over their own labour. In other words, the worker has a master and labour is not a self-directed process. The hierarchical work structure of capitalism is thus conflictual with the materialist conception of freedom. Capitalists and their ideological supporters may well object that there exist legal protections for workers under capitalism, workers' rights. Said protections, historically, have been fought for and won by means of tooth-and-nail class struggle on the part of the working class. Militant labour unions and popular movements, time and time again, have been needed to secure legal restrictions on the length of the working day, the minimum wage, 5 for 15 to name one modern example, and basic health and safety requirements. However, even the idea of rights, legally bestowed upon individuals by powerful institutions, is very limited in scope in a society in which the legal fiction of the contract reigns supreme. As Bertrand Russell wrote in 1928, advocates of capitalism are very apt to appeal to the sacred principles of liberty, which are embodied in one maxim: the fortunate must not be restrained in the exercise of tyranny over the unfortunate. Furthermore, consider also that were it not for the Chartist movement, which began in around 1838, working class men in the UK would not have the right to vote. The suffragettes in the early 20th century secured women's right to vote, much to the dismay of the Daily Mail. Central to anarchism is participation in these kinds of social struggles. What little freedom we do enjoy under capitalism owes itself to the progress made by militant social movements, movements which regularly find themselves being undermined by police, whose primary institutional role is social control and the protection of property. The Anarchist Society. If capitalism is inherently conflictual with the materialist conception of freedom, and if the little freedom that we do enjoy under capitalism is fought for and won by militant social movements, then we are left with a revolutionary question. Is it possible to look beyond capitalism and towards a new social order that would be freer, just, and more humane? During the Spanish Revolution, which broke out during the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, the anarchists of the CNT, Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, and the FAI, Federación Anarquista Ibérica, in the culmination of decades of struggle, presented just such an alternative. Liberals, fascists and Stalinists put aside their political differences and cooperated to ensure that the revolution would be crushed. However, the organisational forms created by the anarchists were documented by historians of the revolution. It must be noted that finding statistical data that we are certain is accurate about the scale of the CNT's activities during the Spanish Revolution is rather difficult, given that they were in the middle of a civil war, and secondly the fact that at the onset of Franco's fascist dictatorship, the CNT was immediately outlawed and an estimated 160,000 to 180,000 members were killed by the government. At its peak, however, the CNT was estimated to have a membership of about 2 million. As to the role which the Liberals and Stalinists played in destroying the free society, the Republican government, after May 1937, began the restoration of private ownership in agriculture and industry, with support from Stalin. Furthermore, Frank Mintz in Anarchism and Workers' Self-Management in Revolutionary Spain has a chapter dedicated to the attacks on self-management that were made by self-described communists. Additionally, Augustin Guillamo describes how the Republican state co-opted the anarchist military struggle against fascism in Ready for Revolution, the CNT defence committees in Barcelona. The defence committees were subsumed into the state militia, anarchists were put into positions in which it was more likely that they would be killed, while the higher-ups in the Republican state took a back seat. It was this state militia which was then defeated by Franco. An explanation as to what kind of society anarchists seek to create, in line with the interconnected ideas of freedom, equality and solidarity, can be given here. Holding that freedom is a social phenomenon, anarchists advocate an organised society based on the free federation of the associated producers. Organising by means of free federation means that workers form democratic institutions, such as workers' councils, through which production is planned. Workers' councils may then federate together through a system of instantly recallable delegates to cover industries and regions. Gaston Leval describes what the Spanish anarchists did in detail in Collectives in the Spanish Revolution, which outlines a number of achievements, including the collectivization of water, gas and electricity, the socialization of medicine, and, in rural areas, the abolition of money. In his reflections on the project late in the book, he writes, "Going deeply into these matters, it could perhaps be said that they were developing a new concept of liberty. In the village collectives in their natural state, and in the small towns where everybody knew one another and were interdependent, liberty did not consist in being a parasite and not interesting oneself in anything. Liberty only existed as a function of practical activity. Men who are interdependent feel free among themselves and naturally respect each other's liberty. Furthermore, so far as collective life is concerned, the freedom of each is the right to participate spontaneously with one's thought, one's heart, one's will, one's initiative to the full extent of one's capacities." Notice that this practical application is consistent with the materialist conception of freedom expounded by Marx and Bakunin. Also, suffice it to say that Andrea Altmares, a social democrat and professor at the University of Geneva, said in an address, "The members of the syndicates are their own masters and carry on the production and the distribution of the products of labour under their own management, with the advice of technical experts in whom they have confidence. The enthusiasm of the workers is so great that they scorn any personal advantage and are concerned only for the welfare of all." This shatters many commonly held misconceptions about anarchism. For example, that it is simply chaos and disorder, or that it gives individuals license to do what they want, no matter the harm caused to others. In fact, as we have already seen, solidarity is an essential part of how anarchists view freedom. Bakunin writes, "The freedom of each individual is the ever-renewing result of numerous material, intellectual and moral influences of the surrounding individuals and of the society into which he is born, and in which he grows up and dies. To wish to escape this influence in the name of a transcendental, divine, absolutely self-sufficient freedom is to condemn oneself to non-existence. To forego the exercise of this freedom upon others is to renounce all social action and all expression of one's thoughts and sentiments, and to end in nothingness. Such absolute independence and such a freedom, the brainchild of idealists and metaphysicians, is a wild absurdity." Conclusion. Revolutionary praxis. We must now turn to the matter of praxis. Praxis is the idea that theory informs action and action informs theory, or, summarised very simply, it is the idea of learning from the experiences of the class struggle and applying what has been learned. A debate rages on among the left as to whether reformism is enough or whether revolutionary action will be required to topple the capitalist system. For example, social democracy, in its inception, began as a movement to bring about socialism by way of reforms. In other words, the long-term vision was to replace capitalism with an entirely different system. Social democracy in the present day, however, due to the limitations given by the state apparatus, has merely become a kinder, gentler way of managing capitalism. If our goal is to secure workers' control over the means of production, then social democracy has surely not delivered. This is not to say that revolutionaries should not care about social democratic reforms, which can make a significant difference to people's lives. Indeed, as anarcho-syndicalist and linguist Noam Chomsky said, to some degree it matters who's in office, but it matters more how much pressure they're under from the public. Let us also consider the Leninist view. The essence of Leninism is the formation of a vanguard party with the principal aim of taking state power. The problem with this is that, historically, Leninist methods have resulted in the collapse of socialism, in other words, the destruction of workers' self-management, and worse, brutal dictatorships. Said dictatorships are certainly not a domain of freedom. The struggle for socialism is the struggle of the working class to live a self-determined life, and since dictatorship certainly does not offer self-determination on the part of the working class, it must be dispensed with. What we are left with is a profound challenge, which is to change the world without taking state power. Our strategy shall be to convince the population to become anarchists and to withdraw our labour, that is, to take direct action and strike. I write in the middle of a pandemic in which many workplaces have had to temporarily close. We see that when labour is not being put into the capitalist system, this cuts off the source of the boss's profits. Strikes work because the capitalist exploitation of labour is the ultimate source of their profit. A general strike could therefore bring the capitalist system to a grinding halt. But this may not be enough to secure workers' control. Anarchists distinguish between social revolution and political revolution. A political revolution is a mere change of leaders. A social revolution overthrows the entire system of domination. Crucial to point out here is that capitalists are extremely unlikely to give up their power and property voluntarily, much as we might want that to happen, and so revolutionary action, violent revolution, will unfortunately be necessary. But given that we cannot support dictatorship, we must ensure that said violence is not made the monopoly of a ruling class, as this would reproduce a class system. Thus, anarchists are in favour of horizontally organised workers' militias to defend a revolution whose principal aim is the abolition of the state and the expropriation of capital, and to bring the means of production under workers' control. If you like this video, follow me on Twitter and support me on Patreon. This has been Libertarian Communist Platform. Thanks for watching.